I'm Franklin. The darkest battles were fought in the human mind. They call Paris the City of Light. But in the autumn of 1951, the light was artificial and the shadows were hungry. Behind the romantic accordion music and the smell of roasting chestnuts, a group of men in gray suits were playing God. They weren't interested in the Eiffel Tower. They were interested in the point of no return. The exact moment a human mind snaps and turns into a weapon. The American embassy was a fortress of secrets, but the real work happened in a nondescript bakery near the Pont Neuf. Julian Vane wasn't a spy. He was a sanitization specialist. His job was to watch the world burn and make sure nobody called the fire department. As he stood on the balcony of a safe house overlooking the Seine, the water didn't look like a river. It looked like a dark, moving vein of liquid coal. The aerosol dispersal was a success, Julian. A man shadowed by the brim of a fedora whispered. This was the chemist, a former Nazi scientist brought to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip and handed a blank check by the CIA's technical services staff. We didn't just put the ergot in the bread, we put the devil in the atmosphere. Julian looked through his high-powered binoculars. Below, in a small plaza, the nightmare was unfolding in slow motion. A young poet, a regular at the cafes, suddenly dropped his notebook. He began to claw at his own face, screaming that invisible spiders were weaving silk into his veins. A mother pushed her stroller into the path of a moving Citroën, her eyes vacant, humming a lullaby that sounded like a funeral dirge. "This isn't a test, is it?" Julian asked, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "This is a demonstration." The chemist lit a cigarette, the orange glow illuminating the cold, clinical joy in his eyes. "The deep state doesn't do tests, Julian. We do feasibility studies for the collapse of civilization. If we can turn the population of the 5th arrondissement into a mindless horde within 6 hours using nothing but a chemical mist, then we don't need nuclear bombs. We can take Moscow without breaking a single window." But then, Julian heard it. A sound that wasn't in the briefing. A low-frequency hum began to vibrate through the floorboards, a rhythmic pulsing thrum that made his teeth ache. It was coming from the catacombs directly beneath the city. "What is that?" Julian demanded. "That," the architect said, appearing from the shadows of the room, "is the Siren Frequency. The chemical opens the door to the mind, Julian. The frequency tells the mind what to do. We are not just making them mad, we are making them ours." Julian looked back at his camera. He had captured it all, but then he saw a figure in the crowd below that made his blood turn to slush. It was his handler's daughter, a girl who shouldn't have been within 5 miles of the hot zone. She was standing perfectly still amidst the chaos, her head tilted at an impossible angle, staring directly up at Julian's window. She wasn't screaming. She was smiling. And in her hand, she held a small, silver pin. The same owl-shaped emblem Julian had seen on the desks of the men who ran the project in Langley. The deep state wasn't just experimenting on the French. They were feeding their own to the machine. Most people think the Paris catacombs are just a graveyard for 6 million souls. They're wrong. For the deep state, those tunnels are a giant, limestone acoustic chamber, a subterranean circuit board designed to amplify a signal that no human ear was ever meant to process. Julian Vane moved through the shadows of the Odeon station, his breath hitching in the damp, metallic air of the metro. The city above was tearing itself apart, but down here, the silence was even more terrifying. It was a thick, unnatural quiet, broken only by that low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate his very marrow. "You're walking into the mouth of the beast, Julian," a voice crackled in his earpiece. It was Sasha, a rogue cryptographer who had spent years tracking the agency's black-budget acoustic research. The Siren Frequency isn't just a sound, it's a carrier wave for a hypnotic command. They're using the iron in the city's plumbing and the tunnels of the metro as a massive antenna. Julian reached a heavy, rusted steel door marked with a fading sign, Propriété de la Ville de Paris, Accès interdit. He didn't use a key. He used a specialized magnetic pulse tool he'd stolen from the chemist's lab. The lock clicked with a sound like a snapping bone. Inside, the smell hit him first. Not the smell of old bones, but the sterile chemical scent of an operating room. The walls of the tunnel were lined with rows of vintage reel-to-reel tape recorders, their spools spinning in perfect, haunting synchronization. At the center of the room sat a massive, brass-encased device that looked like a cross between a pipe organ and a radio transmitter. The resonator. Standing before it was the girl Julian had seen earlier, the handler's daughter. She was no longer smiling. She was strapped into a chair, her head encased in a wire mesh helmet that pulsed with a faint, rhythmic blue light. "She is the tuning fork, Julian." The architect's voice boomed from the shadows of the archway. He stepped into the light, holding a glass of cognac as if he were at a gala, not in a tomb. To control the masses, you need a central node, a human heart that beats at the frequency of the state. She isn't just a victim. She is the conductor of the Paris Symphony. "You're turning a child into a broadcast tower," Julian spat, reaching for his sidearm. "We are turning a child into an anchor for the future of warfare," the architect countered. "Imagine, Julian. No more trenches, no more expensive tanks, just a broadcast. A city sleeps as friends and wakes up as an army ready to slaughter its own leaders. Paris is just the rehearsal. The world is the stage." Suddenly the hum changed. The frequency shifted from a low growl to a high-pitched shriek that bypassed the ears and went straight for the frontal lobe. Julian's vision fractured. The walls seemed to breathe. In the flickering light, the rows of skulls in the walls appeared to open their mouths in a silent, synchronized scream. "The signal is reaching its peak," the architect whispered, his eyes wide with a religious fervor. "Listen, Julian. Can you hear the sound of the New World Order?" Julian knew he couldn't win a gunfight in a room full of ghosts. He looked at the rows of tape recorders. They were the source. If he couldn't stop the broadcast, he would have to corrupt the data. He lunged for the main control board, not to shut it down, but to overload the gain. He slammed his heavy Leica camera into the vacuum tubes, the glass shattering in a spray of white sparks. The frequency didn't stop. It distorted. The effect was instantaneous. Above ground, the mindless horde didn't stop their violence. They turned it toward the source. Through a small ventilation grate high in the ceiling, Julian heard the roar of 1,000 angry Parisians. They weren't just mad anymore. They were a hive mind that had just been poked with a red-hot iron, and they knew exactly where the architect was hiding. "What have you done?" the architect roared, his calm mask finally shattering. "I gave the laboratory rats a better idea," Julian gasped, clutching his bleeding head. "And they're coming for dinner. When a city breaks, it doesn't sound like a war. It sounds like an orchestra tuning its instruments in hell." The Siren Frequency had done its job too well. The distortion Julian introduced into the resonator hadn't shut down the signal. It had inverted it. Instead of docile obedience, the frequency was now broadcasting pure, unadulterated panic. Deep beneath the streets of the Latin Quarter, the secret bunker was vibrating. The heavy steel doors, designed to withstand a Soviet airstrike, were buckling under the pressure of human bodies. The mob outside, The very citizens the architect had tried to enslave were now tearing at the metal with their bare hands, their minds locked into a singular, violent loop by the corrupted signal. "You've killed us!" the architect screamed, his composed demeanor shattering like cheap glass. He scrambled backward, knocking over reels of magnetic tape that unspooled across the floor like dead snakes. "Do you know how much this facility cost? Do you know how many years of research you just destroyed?" Julian didn't answer. He was busy cutting the leather straps that bound the girl, the tuning fork, to the chair. Her eyes were still wide, reflecting the sparks raining down from the smashed vacuum tubes, but the blue light in the helmet had died. She was catatonic, a vessel emptied of its soul. "We're leaving," Julian growled, hauling the girl to her feet. She was light, terrifyingly so, as if the experiments had hollowed out her bones. "You can't go out there," the architect pleaded, pulling a small Walther PPK from his jacket, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. "They'll tear you apart. The frequency identifies us as the source of the pain." Julian looked at the man who had treated Paris like a petri dish. "No," Julian said cold. "They're coming for you. You're the one holding the gun. You're the one who smells like fear." Before the architect could raise the weapon, the main doors gave way. The sound was deafening. A screech of tearing metal followed by the roar of 100 voices screaming in unison. It wasn't a language. It was pure noise. Julian grabbed the girl and sprinted toward the emergency maintenance shaft. He didn't look back. Behind him, the screams of the architect were cut short by the sickening sound of the mob descending upon him like a swarm of locusts. The deep state's own creation had returned to devour its master. The climb was brutal. The maintenance ladder was slick with condensation and centuries of slime. Julian carried the girl over his shoulder, his lungs burning. Above them, through the iron grates, he could see the flickering orange glow of fires reflecting off the wet cobblestones. Paris was burning. They emerged in a narrow alleyway behind the Pantheon. The fresh air smelled of smoke, tear gas, and roasting chestnuts, a grotesque mix of the normal and the apocalyptic. "We need to get to the extraction point," Julian whispered to the girl, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "The embassy rooftop. It's the only way out." But the streets were a war zone. People were wandering aimlessly, attacking lampposts, smashing shop windows, or simply staring at the sky, weeping. The blue dot toxin combined with the frequency had stripped away civilization. It was the Stone Age with electricity. Julian moved through the shadows, avoiding the main boulevards. He used his knowledge of the city's veins, the narrow passages, the rooftops, the hidden stairwells used by the resistance during the war. Finally, they reached the roof of a secure safe house near the Luxembourg Gardens. The view from the top was a majestic, terrifying panorama. The Eiffel Tower stood like a black needle against a sky choked with smoke. Police sirens wailed in the distance, but they sounded weak, overwhelmed by the chaos. Thwup, thwup, thwup. The sound of rotors cutting the air. A black helicopter, unmarked, with no navigation lights, descended from the clouds like a predatory bird. It wasn't the French police. It was Unit 731B, the CIA's specialized retrieval team. The chopper hovered just feet above the slate roof, kicking up a storm of dust and debris. A side door slid open, and a man in a hazmat suit extended a hand. "Hand over the asset, Vane," the voice crackled over a loudspeaker. Julian clutched the girl tighter. "She needs a doctor. She's in shock." "She is classified hardware," the voice barked back. "Hand her over, and you get a ride home. Keep her, and you stay here with the rats." Julian looked at the girl. She blinked, once, and a single tear rolled down her cheek. In that moment, Julian realized the truth. There was no rescue. There was only recovery. They didn't care about the chaos in the streets. They didn't care about the architect. They only wanted the tuning fork back so they could recalibrate her for the next city. Maybe Berlin, maybe London, maybe New York. "She's a child!" Julian screamed over the roar of the rotors, drawing his weapon. But he was too slow. A sniper from the helicopter fired a single, silenced dart. It hit Julian in the neck. His world instantly went numb. His knees buckled. He fell to the cold slate of the roof, his vision blurring. He felt strong hands pry the girl from his grip. He tried to fight, but his muscles were water. "Secure the package," a distant voice said. "Sanitize the area. Leave the agent. He's burnt." Through the haze, Julian watched as they loaded the girl into the dark belly of the machine. She looked back at him one last time, her expression blank, before the door slid shut. The helicopter rose into the night, disappearing into the smoke, taking the only innocent thing left in Paris with it. Julian was left alone on the roof, the sound of the burning city rising up to meet him. He closed his eyes, listening to the fading hum of the frequency. The experiment was over. The data had been collected, and the world would never know. The next morning, the newspapers didn't talk about mind control or frequencies. They ran a story about a tragic outbreak of food poisoning caused by contaminated flour in the local bakeries. They called it Le Pain Maudit, the cursed bread. The official report blamed a fungus called ergot, which causes hallucinations. The scientists nodded, the doctors agreed, and the public went back to sleep. The dead were buried, the asylum wards were filled, and the city of Paris rebuilt its facade of romance. Julian Vane survived, but he didn't return to the agency. He spent the rest of his life in a small cabin in Montana, far away from any radio towers, writing letters that he never mailed. But sometimes, on quiet nights in Paris, if you stand near the ventilation grates of the metro, you can still hear it. A low, rhythmic thrumming in the pipes. It's not the trains. It's the echo of the experiment. The deep state never turns off the machine, my friends. They just turn down the volume until they need it again.